The X-Men is one of the biggest franchises in all of comic books. We've had the X-Men movies, and it's been hit or miss. And I think a lot of people, since the Fox acquisition by Disney, have been waiting for the X-Men to finally come in to the MCU. We thought maybe we would get a teaser in the Spider-Man movie or perhaps the Doctor Strange movie, and it really wasn't there. There was a slight cameo of a version of Professor X who was murdered off very quickly in Doctor Strange. Sorry if you haven't seen it. I guess there's light spoilers there. But for the most part, the X-Men and mutants are non-existent within the MCU until this week. We finally got the first hints and the first actual mutant in the MCU, and I think a lot of people are going to be very disappointed that it's Miss Marvel. Now, traditionally, Miss Marvel is an Inhuman, and one of the funny things about the creation of the character and them trying to make her big is because Fox owned the movie rights to X-Men, and they were trying to downplay that franchise within comic books, and they were trying to lift up Inhumans to replace them. And Miss Marvel was revealed to be an Inhuman, and she was created through the Terrigen Mist and all that stuff within the comic books. But the Inhumans, they failed in the MCU. They tried to do it on ABC with the TV show. That thing was just really awful. Nobody liked it. It's one of the worst things you could really watch in television history. So they needed to do something with the character. And me personally, I think making her a mutant and potential future X-Men within the MCU is kind of a smart move, but I think they've gone about it the worst way possible. They have set so many obstacles, not only for Miss Marvel in the future, but really for the X-Men and mutants within the MCU moving forward. And that's a really big mistake because they've really only got two enormous hero bullets left to fire. We've pretty much seen all the really big heroes within the MCU. We're about to have Deadpool, who's a popular character within the MCU. We'll see how that goes. But you have the X-Men finally being incorporated, and you have the Fantastic Four. Sounds like the Fantastic Four is further along in production, and people have been waiting for some type of tease about the X-Men, which are right now, quite frankly, a much more popular superhero team than the Fantastic Four. Yes, we've had Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch within the MCU, but those clearly aren't related to mutants whatsoever. Their powers were generated through an Infinity Stone because Fox still had the rights to the X-Men movies. So they could use Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch, but they couldn't be connected to Magneto. So they came up with a unique origin story for the characters. So we haven't really seen a mutant other than that very brief cameo, but that really wasn't an introduction of Professor X or the X-Men into the MCU. That was in another weird multiverse that clearly is not going to play into the plans of the MCU. So we get the first taste, the first confirmation that there are mutants in the X-Men coming. We get a little music there too. I'm going to go over why this is an enormous mistake in my opinion. But first, let's talk about how it was introduced, just in case you miss it and you're an X-Men fan and you want to know how they've introduced the X-Men into the MCU, or at least the idea of the X-Men. Certainly not the X-Men, but mutants themselves. Just before the credits roll on the final episode of Miss Marvel, Kamala has one more fateful chat with Bruno. He tells her that he took another look at her genetic makeup because her brother Amir wouldn't stop pestering with questions about why he didn't have powers or if he could have powers. This is what Bruno has to say. When I compared you to the rest of your family, something still seemed off. He then tells her that there's something different in her genes, like a mutation. And when Bruno says that word, an electric guitar in the soundtrack flicks through the first 7 notes of the infamous theme song from 1992's X-Men, the animated series. So that is clearly a tease that the X-Men are coming. And it sounds like we'll probably get an announcement, at least with some general information about the X-Men future in the MCU in the weeks and months ahead. But I think this was an enormous mistake, really for 4 reasons. They've essentially wasted one of their big bullets. This is the introduction of the idea of the mutants and X-Men into the MCU. What a huge wasted opportunity to really get a lot of buzz going. And I'm talking about positive buzz where people are like, oh, finally we saw Professor X, or finally we saw the new version of Wolverine silhouettes or something like that, that let you know that the characters are out there and they're about to make their presence known in the MCU. I think they wasted a huge opportunity to get people talking in a very positive way on the Miss Marvel show, which quite frankly is viewed far less than any other MCU show on Disney+. I understand the need to get a better or new origin for Miss Marvel. And I think making her a mutant isn't the worst idea in the history of the world. Actually, I think it kind of makes sense. She can't be an Inhuman. That flopped, and they're not doing Inhumans again. It kind of does make sense. Yeah, let's just make her a mutant. But they did it in the wrong order. They needed to introduce a mainstay character that was very recognizable into the MCU itself first. Preferably Professor X, but Wolverine would have made sense. Cyclops would have made sense. Even Storm, I guess, if you really wanted to. And that way, in this seed, in Miss Marvel, when they let people know that she's a mutant, Professor X is the one that says, I've been looking for you. I have information that you want to know about your powers and where they come from. But he's already been introduced in a previous movie, most likely Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, in an end credit scene or something like that. And it would have built anticipation. And this wouldn't have been the first real instance of the X-Men idea or mutants within the MCU itself, because it's getting the wrong kind of conversation, in my opinion. The second mistake with this, I understand what they're doing. They're trying to define up the character of Miss Marvel as being more important by associating her with the X-Men. But by introducing the idea with Miss Marvel and her essentially being the first X-Man or the first recognized mutant within the MCU, it really defines down the interest and the importance of the X-Men down to Miss Marvel's level. She's not an A-list character. She's not a B-list character. She's like a D, E, F-list character. This isn't a really popular character within anything, and you can see it within the viewership of the show on Disney+. It is not even close. It is the lowest viewed MCU show on Disney+ that they've ever done, and it's by a factor of half. Half as many people watched that as watched Hawkeye. So you're not really putting shine on the idea of mutants and X-Men by associating it at first with Miss Marvel. They're trying to define up the character and make her seem more important in the MCU itself because people are excited for mutants in the X-Men. But in the process, they make it seem unimportant because if the X-Men were important and they had big plans for the X-Men, they wouldn't have introduced the idea or the concept. But obviously, those ideas and concepts are introduced in comic books and even movies, but they wouldn't have confirmed them in the MCU in a property as unimportant as Miss Marvel itself. So it makes the X-Men and the arrival of mutants in the MCU feel really unimportant in comparison to what it should. So instead of defining Miss Marvel up, you just defined like 100 characters down in the process, and I think that was a huge mistake. Another thing that could really backfire on Kevin Feige and the brain trust in Marvel Studios surrounding the MCU is while there wasn't a lot of viewership associated with Miss Marvel, because it was generally speaking promoted as and it advertised as a kid's show. It wasn't really something a lot of adults and longtime MCU fans were going to be really interested in, but it was something I think in time, because of the quality of the show, which a lot of people are lauding, they probably would have went back to watch and really appreciated potentially what they were doing there, especially if they ended up connecting Miss Marvel with some cool things like perhaps the X-Men in the future. But because they've introduced this idea in the end and you know where you're moving towards, and it's something that I think is going to be very divisive and I don't think people are really going to like, those viewers that had skipped it to begin with but maybe go back and watch it in the future might hate watch it. They might watch it with the anticipation of hating it by the end, because they realize this is going to be the introduction of the first mutant or the first X-Man within the MCU itself. So you've kind of poisoned the well around Miss Marvel in the MCU when you've done so much work to really uplift the character and spotlight her and make some changes and tweaks to the character to make the character work better than MCU and really make a lot more sense for the universe moving forward. But introducing the idea in the end could make a lot of people, specifically X-Men fans, specifically MCU fans or X-Men movie fans, which there are a lot of, those made a lot of money, to go and hate watch the thing with the knowledge that they're going to hate the reveal in the end. And instead of enjoying how much better it was than they were really anticipating, and maybe missing out on what a lot of people are saying is the highest quality MCU show on Disney Plus so far. And that's been a big issue, is the quality of the MCU on Disney Plus so far, in my opinion. And it sounded like this might have been changing some opinions, and they kind of poisoned the well on that. And the final thing that I think they've really done here, obviously I don't think it's intentional, but they've really created negative controversy around the X-Men before they've ever announced anything about the X-Men. We do know that the production's going to happen. Kevin Feige has talked about it here and there, but they haven't announced a director. They haven't announced a date that it's going to go in. They haven't announced any of the actors or anything that are going to be associated with the X-Men when they finally enter into the MCU. We don't even know when the first cameo is going to happen. And people aren't talking about how they're excited about the MCU right now. They're talking about how they're pissed that Miss Marvel, a character that's never been associated with the X-Men or been identified as a mutant, is the first mutant in the MCU. So you've created this negative backlash, this negative feeling towards really one of the big properties that was going to be able to lift up and boost interest in the MCU moving forward. I think this is a huge strategic blunder. By introducing Miss Marvel as the first mutant, the first X-Man, you've just created negativity around the brand itself, and the MCU isn't bulletproof like it used to be. If they had introduced Shang-Chi 3 or 4 years ago, it would have made $800 million. If they would have introduced the Eternals 3 or 4 years ago, it probably would have made $950, maybe $1 billion, because the MCU was bulletproof. But they've had a lot of movies that underperformed lately. Now, they have had some stuff that's gone really well, but you think about the Spider-Man movie. You had a lot of stuff that people were excited for that was stuffed into there that brought out good feelings that they've had about Spider-Man in the past. That was like a lot of fan service. Doctor Strange, the Multiverse of Madness, you're introducing a lot of the new concepts of the multiverse into the MCU, but we also knew it was going to be heavy on cameos. I think a lot of people were hopeful that we were going to see X-Men really for the first time, or at least the idea of them in there for the first time. It sounds like Thor Love and Thunder is also doing well, but that's an established property within the MCU. I don't think this is going to kill off the X-Men, but it certainly isn't the conversation Kevin Feige and the MCU wanted surrounding the X-Men, because they've got a lot of big plans coming up. Next week, in fact, Marvel is returning to San Diego Comic-Con for a traditional Hall H panel where the studio has promised that Kevin Feige and special guests will provide an inside look at the ever-expanding Marvel Cinematic Universe. And then 7 weeks later, Disney features a multi-hour-long panel at the company's D23 event entirely focused on Marvel Studios and the Lucasfilm projects. So instead of people being really excited about this and kind of keying in on going, there's a good chance X-Men is going to be at least announced and maybe some of the details given, they're already going, oh, it's the MCU all over again. All of a sudden Miss Marvel's more important than the X-Men kind of thing. And I don't know, it's just not a good conversation. It's not something that you want clouding what is potentially like $1 billion franchise within the MCU itself. They need X-Men to be really successful if the MCU is going to have legs after Phase 4. It's a really important franchise, and I do think they bungled this. I like the idea. You needed to do something with the origin of Miss Marvel that was going to make more sense within the future of the MCU. The Inhumans weren't going to cut it. The mutant thing makes sense, but making her the first mutant, the first announced mutant, recognized mutant within the MCU, terrible mistake. And it certainly doesn't help that there hasn't been a lot of viewership associated with Miss Marvel. And I don't think many people are going to come back and watch it later as they would before. Definitely check this out if you're unfamiliar with just how bad Miss Marvel bombed on Disney+. It's actually quite eye-opening when you see how it performed in comparison to the peers on the platform.